There are some mornings when the fog feels thicker than usual, settling over the rolling green hills of the Cotswolds like a soft, silvery blanket. On days like these, the world grows quiet, and even the birds seem to speak in whispers. That's exactly how it was when Arthur unlocked the gate to his old stone farmhouse, boots sinking into dew-soaked grass as he strode toward the pastures. Arthur was a man shaped by the land, tall, stoic, the kind of presence that calmed horses and unsettled debt collectors. For nearly 3 decades, he had run this farm with a gentle but steady hand, earning the trust of every creature that walked or grazed its fields. But this morning, his mind was not at peace. Something was troubling him, something about Willow. Willow was no ordinary horse. She was an Anglo-Arabian mare, retired now, but in her prime, she had flown down racetracks like the wind itself. Even in her later years, she carried herself with the effortless elegance of an athlete, head held high, mane glistening like spun gold in the morning light. Arthur loved her fiercely, the way a quiet man loves, through care, attention, and the wordless bonds of routine. Usually Willow greeted Arthur at the fence, ears pricked forward, ready for her oats. But today, she was nowhere near the feeding trough. Instead, she stood at the edge of the property's ancient pond, her hooves half submerged in chilly, mist-wreathed water. Arthur stopped, brow furrowed. It wasn't like her to wander down to the pond, not at this hour, not with the fog clinging to everything. He watched, heart thumping just a little faster than usual, as Willow took another cautious step deeper into the water. He glanced over his shoulder at the barn, half expecting to see one of the other horses following, but they all lingered at the fence, heads down, munching idly. Only Willow was drawn to the water this morning. He made his way toward her, the damp air filling his lungs. Willow lifted her head and looked at him, her eyes bright, almost searching for something. Arthur felt a chill crawl along his spine. She stood motionless for a moment, then dipped her nose to the pond's surface, lips barely skimming the water, as if waiting for something to happen. "Willow, what are you doing?" The question flickered through his mind as he stepped to the pond's edge. The water was so still, the fog so dense, it was as if time had paused around them. He crouched beside her, running a hand down her sleek neck. Her muscles trembled, not with cold, but with anticipation. He scanned the banks, searching for any sign, a strange animal, an unfamiliar scent, maybe even the glint of something foreign beneath the water. But there was nothing, just the whisper of fog, the soft murmur of Willow's breath, and the distant sound of the farmhouse clock chiming 8. Arthur stood, brushing dew from his jeans. Maybe Willow was just thirsty, or maybe she found comfort in the cold water on her aching joints. Horses did strange things sometimes. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He stayed by her side until she finally pulled herself from the pond and returned, almost reluctantly, to the paddock. But the unease wouldn't leave him. Later that day, after breakfast, Arthur found himself talking about it with his neighbor, Mr. Hargrove. They stood by the fence, coffee in hand, watching their herds graze. "You ever see a horse act that way?" Arthur asked, keeping his tone light. Hargrove set his mug on a fence post, eyes narrowing in thought. "Funny you mention it," he said, voice low. "My old mare Daisy did something strange yesterday morning. Wouldn't touch her feed, just wandered down to the creek and stood there, up to her knees in water. Never seen her do that before, not in all her 15 years. Arthur felt a jolt, so it wasn't just Willow. He listened as Hargrove described Daisy's odd behavior, and then, as if on cue, two other neighbors passing by joined the conversation. Each had a similar story: horses abandoning their routines, wading into ponds or creeks, staring into the water as if mesmerized. A shiver passed between them. Horses were creatures of habit. When something changed, especially in more than one animal, it meant there was a reason they didn't yet understand. Maybe there's something in the water, Hargrove mused, his attempt at humor sounding thin. Arthur didn't laugh. He looked out across the fields, suddenly aware of the interconnectedness of this quiet community, their worries, their livelihoods, their trust in nature's rhythms. If something was affecting the horses, it was no longer just his concern. The day dragged on, and Arthur found himself drawn to Willow again and again. She grazed quietly now, but he noticed how often she glanced back toward the pond, ears flicking at sounds only she could hear. At supper, Arthur sat at his kitchen table, the ticking of the clock loud in the silence. He sipped his tea and replayed the day's conversations in his mind. What was Willow searching for in that pond? Was it comfort, relief, or something more mysterious? And why were other horses behaving the same way? His mind wandered to old stories his father used to tell, tales of omens, signs in nature, warnings that only those who paid close attention could see. He shook his head. He wasn't a superstitious man, but he was a careful one. As dusk settled and a cold wind brushed against the window pane, Arthur stepped outside one last time. The farm was quiet, bathed in silver-blue moonlight. Willow stood near the fence, closer to the pond than usual, her silhouette soft against the fog. Arthur made a decision. He couldn't ignore this, not if it threatened his horses, his neighbors, or the land he loved. He needed answers, real ones, rooted in reason and science. Tomorrow, he would reach out for help. But tonight, as he watched Willow lift her head and gaze into the night, Arthur felt a pang of something he hadn't felt in years. A sense of mystery, of being on the edge of something unknown. He whispered into the cool air, "I'll find out what's going on here, Willow. I promise." And with that, the first threads of a much larger mystery began to weave their way through the peaceful meadows of Cotswolds, pulling Arthur and his beloved horse into a journey that would touch every corner of their quiet world. The pond shimmered under the moon, silent and still. But in that silence, Arthur knew a question had been asked, and it would not rest until it found its answer. The morning after Willow's strange behavior, Arthur barely slept. He awoke before sunrise, lying in bed with his mind turning over every detail, the fog, the water, the anxious look in Willow's eyes. The old farmhouse felt colder than usual, and for the first time in years, Arthur hesitated before starting his daily chores. He moved through his morning routine on autopilot, feeding the horses, checking the fences, scanning the skies for any sign of oncoming rain. But all the while, the thought gnawed at him. I need answers. This isn't just Willow. It's happening across the village. By mid-morning, Arthur wiped his hands on his work pants, walked back into the house, and reached for the phone that hung on the kitchen wall. He'd kept the number for Dr. Eleanor Vance on a scrap of paper near the phone for months. She was the newest veterinarian in the region, recommended by several neighboring farms, a specialist in equine medicine with a reputation for both intelligence and a grounded scientific approach. Some called her brilliant, others thought she was a bit too by the book. But right now, that was exactly what Arthur wanted. He dialed, waiting as the ring buzzed in his ear. The phone clicked, and a crisp, clear voice answered. Cotswold Valley Veterinary Services, Dr. Vance speaking. Arthur took a breath, steadying himself. Morning, Doctor. This is Arthur Graves from Broadmeadow Farm, Willow's owner. I was hoping you could help me with something a bit unusual. He explained, his words slow and measured, detailing Willow's strange trip to the pond and how she lingered in the water, silent and still. As he spoke, Arthur could almost hear Dr. Vance's mind working, weighing the information. At first, she seemed skeptical. Horses sometimes seek water for comfort, especially older mares with joint pain, she said, her tone pragmatic. But you say this happened at dawn, in the cold, and that other horses on neighboring farms did the same. Arthur nodded, even though she couldn't see him. Yes, ma'am. 4 farms, all in the last day or so. It's not just Willow. None of them seemed sick. No colic, no fever, nothing. For a moment, Dr. Vance said nothing. Then he heard her shuffle papers, perhaps searching her notes for any similar cases. I'll be honest, Arthur. That is very unusual, particularly at this time of year with this weather. Did you notice any chemical smell in the water? Any signs of runoff from the fields? No. Water looks clean, clear as ever. I checked for algae blooms, dead fish, but saw nothing strange. And the other ponds, the same. Just horses standing in the water, like they're waiting for something. Dr. Vance's voice grew sharper, a hint of curiosity edging out her earlier skepticism. Have you seen any changes in their appetites, their energy levels? Are any of them showing signs of skin irritation? Neurological symptoms? No, nothing like that. Willow's acting normal now, eating and walking fine. Just keeps looking back toward the pond. The line went silent again, and Arthur pictured Dr. Vance somewhere in her tidy office tapping her pen against the desk. I want to come out and see for myself, Arthur. If you're right, this could be something we need to look at closely, not just for your horses, but for the community. When can I visit? Relief flooded Arthur's chest, mixing with a spike of new anxiety. Anytime. Today, if possible. I'll be there by lunch, and I'll bring a testing kit for water samples, just in case. Arthur thanked her, set the phone down, and exhaled slowly. There was comfort in knowing a professional was on her way, but the uncertainty gnawed at him all the same. As he waited, Arthur went to the barn and cleaned the tack room, the rhythm of work steadying his nerves. He glanced at Willow every few minutes, watching her graze quietly near the fence, her eyes still drifting toward the pond. Now that the decision had been made to bring in help, the air around the farm seemed to buzz with tension. He noticed small things he'd never cared about before. The odd silence from the birds, the way the wind felt just a little off. At noon sharp, a blue Subaru with the veterinary clinic's logo pulled up the drive. Dr. Eleanor Vance stepped out, crisp in a dark green jacket and khaki pants, a stethoscope hanging around her neck. Her eyes were alert, scanning the land with a kind of quick, focused intensity that made Arthur immediately trust her. They shook hands, Arthur noting the strength in her grip. Let's see Willow first, Dr. Vance said, not wasting a second. She spoke with authority, but not arrogance, and Arthur appreciated that. He led her to the paddock, where Willow grazed near the pond. Dr. Vance spent several minutes observing the mare, running her hands along Willow's legs and flanks, checking her temperature, feeling for swollen joints. Her vital signs are perfect, she murmured. No sign of infection, dehydration, or trauma. She turned to Arthur. Can you show me exactly where she went into the water? They walked to the edge of the pond, Arthur pointing out the spot. Dr. Vance knelt, took a small sample of water in a vial, then sniffed it, frowning thoughtfully. No odor, no residue on the surface. How deep did she go? Up to her knees, maybe a little higher. Dr. Vance studied the water for a moment longer, then stood, brushing her knees. Let's walk the property. I'd like to see the other horses and take a few more samples. They visited 2 more paddocks and checked a second pond on Arthur's land, then drove to Hargrove's farm next door. There, Dr. Vance repeated her routine, checking the animals, questioning the owners, collecting water samples. By early afternoon, the initial examination was complete, and Dr. Vance leaned against her car, jotting notes. I've seen nothing like this before, she admitted. No sign of illness, no toxins in the water, no clear environmental triggers. But the pattern is too specific to ignore. Arthur felt a flicker of hope and worry at once. He was relieved she took it seriously, but unsettled by the lack of answers. Will you send the water to a lab? He asked. Absolutely. And I'll reach out to a few colleagues who specialize in animal behavior and environmental science. This isn't just your problem anymore, Arthur. It might be the whole valley's. Arthur glanced back at Willow, who even now stood near the pond, as if waiting for something only she could sense. Dr. Vance packed her equipment and offered Arthur a reassuring smile. We'll get to the bottom of this. I promise. In the meantime, if anything changes, anything at all, call me. Day or night. He nodded, feeling a little less alone. As Dr. Vance drove away, Arthur found himself staring at the pond, wondering what secrets might be hidden beneath its mirror-still surface. That evening, as the sun set behind the hills, Arthur sat on his porch, phone in hand, ready to call Dr. Vance at the first sign of trouble. The land was quiet, the sky streaked with pink and gold. But in that peaceful silence, a new kind of tension lingered, one that bound Arthur, his neighbors, and their beloved horses together in the face of an invisible, mysterious force. For the first time in his life, Arthur wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring. But one thing was certain. He wasn't going to stop until he found the truth. The morning after Dr. Vance's visit arrived with an unusual sense of urgency. Word traveled fast in a place like the Cotswolds, especially when it came to anything out of the ordinary. By sunrise, Arthur's phone buzzed with messages from neighboring farmers, some anxious, some skeptical, all of them hoping for a simple answer that never seemed to come. He glanced at the most recent text. Another one of ours just stood in the brook for half an hour this morning. Should we be worried? Arthur hesitated to answer. He wanted to reassure them, but the truth was, the more he heard, the less sure he felt. What had begun as an odd moment with Willow was clearly not an isolated event. It was something bigger, a mystery quietly unfolding across the hills, weaving its way through every barn, paddock, and muddy track. Shortly after breakfast, Dr. Vance returned, her small SUV packed with fresh equipment and a grim, focused look on her face. The two of them didn't waste time with pleasantries. The air was brisk and sharp as they set out, Arthur driving the old farm truck while Dr. Vance sat beside him, her phone in her lap and a battered notepad balanced on her knee. Their first stop was the farm just north of Arthur's, where 3 horses stood along the edge of a wide stream. All 3 had muddy fetlocks, damp tails, and a haunted, far-away look. Their owner, Mrs. Barnett, stood nearby with her arms crossed tightly, her face etched with worry. It's not just 1 or 2, she said, voice taut. It's all of them. They go down to the water, stand there like statues, then wander off and act like nothing's happened. Dr. Vance moved quickly but gently, her manner as calm as the early morning breeze. She approached the horses, letting them sniff her hand before she checked their legs and eyes. She watched their breathing, their posture, the way they turned their heads when she called softly. "What do you think, Doctor?" Mrs. Barnett asked. "I think your horses are physically healthy," Dr. Vance replied. "But I agree, it's not normal. It's not just curiosity or a hot day. Something's drawing them in." She collected more water samples, scraping the surface, dipping vials under the current, and carefully noting the time and location for each. Arthur watched, uneasy. He had never seen the horses so subdued. Normally, they would have been prancing, nickering, jostling for treats. Today, they were quiet as ghosts. The next stop was Hargrove's farm, then across to the Cottons' land, then further still to a farm on the village's far edge, where a herd of sturdy Welsh ponies grazed near a narrow brook. At each farm, the pattern repeated. Healthy horses drawn to water, standing still for long minutes, then returning to normal as if nothing had happened. Even the older animals, creatures set in their ways, seemed powerless to resist. As the day wore on, the tension grew thicker. By noon, the two had visited 5 farms. At every one, the story was the same. Owners whispered to one another, trading rumors and theories. Some suspected a contaminant, others an invisible illness. Still others spoke in hushed voices of old superstitions, the kind passed down from one generation to the next, always resurfacing in times of fear. After their last stop before lunch, Arthur and Dr. Vance pulled off the narrow lane and parked at the edge of a rolling field, just out of sight of the neighboring farmhouses. Dr. Vance leaned forward, elbows on her knees, her face shadowed beneath the brim of her cap. "This isn't just one farm," she said quietly. "It's everywhere. I've seen similar behavior in animals before, but never spreading so quickly, so uniformly, and never in horses, especially not in this weather." Arthur stared out the window at the sunlit fields, struggling to find words. "Do you think it's in the water?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. "I honestly don't know." Dr. Vance shook her head. "The samples I've collected so far look normal to the naked eye. I'll have to wait for the lab work to be sure. But if there's something here, something we can't see—" She let the sentence hang in the air, unfinished. Arthur closed his eyes for a moment. The sense of unease pressed in on him, heavier than ever. Dr. Vance straightened, determination flickering in her eyes. "I want to try something. I need to feel what the horses are feeling. Would you mind if I stepped into the water myself?" Arthur looked at her, surprised. "Is that safe?" She nodded. "I'll just wade in a few feet, keep my boots on. If there's something unusual, temperature, sensation, anything, I might notice it." Arthur led her to the nearest pond, its edges trampled and muddy from so many restless hooves. Dr. Vance paused at the shore, slipped a plastic cover over her boots, and slowly stepped into the water. Arthur watched, heart thumping. The surface rippled around her legs. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Dr. Vance stopped, mid-stride. Her posture changed. She stood very still, staring down at her boots, almost as if she were listening for a voice no one else could hear. Arthur held his breath. Dr. Vance crouched, dipped her hand into the water, and closed her eyes. "There's something here," she murmured. "Not a smell, not a taste. It's a feeling, like a faint vibration, almost like a massage against my boots." Arthur glanced at Willow, who watched from the paddock, ears tilted forward, tense and curious. Dr. Vance stood, her face serious now. I've never experienced anything quite like it. It's very subtle, but if I were a horse with sensitive skin on my legs, I might be drawn to it too. They returned to dry ground. Dr. Vance scribbled furiously in her notepad, her lips pressed in a tight line. "I'll want to run a full chemical and biological analysis," she said. "There could be an environmental factor we're not seeing, something creating that sensation in the water. A new organism, maybe, or a change in the soil." Arthur nodded, feeling both relieved and unsettled. At least they had a lead. But it was a lead wrapped in new questions, not answers. The rest of the afternoon blurred by as they visited a few more farms and gathered samples. At each stop, the story was the same. Arthur could sense a shift among the farmers, cooperation replacing suspicion, the beginnings of a community rallying together against a shared threat. By late afternoon, Dr. Vance was ready to return to her clinic. She loaded her equipment, eyes already distant, running through her mental checklist of calls to make, samples to process, experts to consult. As Arthur watched her drive away, he felt a surge of gratitude, tinged with apprehension. They were closer to a clue, but the stakes were higher than ever. It wasn't just his horse. It wasn't just his land. It was the whole valley. And maybe if they didn't act quickly, the problem could grow even larger. That night, Arthur called a meeting at the old barn near the crossroads. Farmers gathered, some with worry on their faces, others with the stoic resignation of people who'd seen enough storms to know when to prepare for the worst. Arthur spoke first, telling the group what he'd seen, what Dr. Vance suspected. He didn't have answers yet, but he had hope. Together, he said, they'd get through it. They always had. As the group broke up, murmurs of support and plans to stay vigilant rippled through the air. Arthur returned home, exhaustion dragging at his bones, but something else there too, a new resolve. He stood for a long while beside the pond, watching the moon rise. Willow approached, resting her head on his shoulder, her breath warm against his cheek. "We're going to find out what this is," Arthur whispered. "I promise." In the distance, the lights of other farms blinked in the darkness, a constellation of neighbors drawn together by a mystery that refused to let go. The morning after the barn meeting, the Cotswolds woke beneath a sky scrubbed clean by rain. Sunlight broke through lingering clouds, glittering on the damp fields, and Arthur felt a rare optimism as he watched Willow graze peacefully with the others. For the first time in days, the horses seemed calm. But the questions still gnawed at him, just below the surface. As promised, Dr. Eleanor Vance worked through the night. Her small laboratory above the veterinary office was bathed in fluorescent light, cluttered with glass vials, test tubes, and stacks of scientific journals. She hadn't slept in over 30 hours, running test after test on the water samples, checking for pesticides, heavy metals, bacteria, anything she could think of. By mid-morning, Arthur's phone rang. He snatched it up, heart pounding. "Arthur, it's Eleanor. I found something," she said, her voice a mixture of exhaustion and excitement. "I think you'd better come to the lab. Bring any of the other farmers who want to hear this. I want everyone to understand what's going on." Within an hour, Arthur pulled up to the little clinic. The parking lot was crowded with familiar faces. Hargrove, Mrs. Barnett, the Cottons, a few others. The air buzzed with anticipation and apprehension. Dr. Vance ushered them inside, her hair pulled back and her eyes rimmed red from lack of sleep. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. Instead, she led them upstairs to her lab, where a microscope sat next to rows of water samples, each labeled with the date and the name of the farm. "Thank you for coming," Dr. Vance began, standing behind the cluttered work table. "You all know how strange this week has been. I promised I'd find answers, and I think I have." She held up a clear vial. Tiny, darting shapes flickered inside. "I found something alive in your ponds," she said. "Something that shouldn't be here." The room fell silent. Even the gruffest of the farmers leaned forward. "At first, I assumed it was just a local fish fry, minnows or sticklebacks," Dr. Vance continued. "But when I looked closer, I realized these are Garra Rufa, more commonly known as doctor fish. They're not native to England. You might have heard of them from those spa treatments where fish nibble at people's skin." A ripple of disbelief ran through the group. Hargrove raised a skeptical eyebrow. "You're telling me our horses are getting a pedicure?" Dr. Vance cracked a smile for the first time in days. "In a way, yes. The sensation I felt in the water yesterday was from these little fish. They attach themselves to exposed skin and gently nibble, creating a massage-like feeling. For a horse whose legs are more sensitive than you might think, it could be almost irresistible, especially for older animals with aches or scars." Arthur stared at the vial, stunned. "How did they get here?" "That's the next mystery," Dr. Vance said, her tone shifting back to business. Garra Rufa are sometimes kept illegally in home aquariums or released by accident. Flooding last winter could have allowed some to escape into local waterways. Once established, they thrive if the conditions are right. Mrs. Barnett spoke up, voice thin with worry. "Are they dangerous?" Dr. Vance shook her head. "Not to your horses, at least not directly. There's no sign of disease or infection. But they are an invasive species, and that means they could disrupt our local ecosystem if we're not careful." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "Here's the critical part. These fish explain the horse's behavior. They're seeking out the ponds because the sensation is pleasant, maybe even soothing. It isn't disease or contamination, but a biological response." Arthur ran a hand over his face, relief mixing with awe. "So we don't need to worry about losing our animals?" Dr. Vance gave a cautious nod. "For now, no. But we do have to manage this. Invasive species can have consequences down the line. We need a plan to monitor and possibly remove the Garra Rufa before they spread further." A low murmur of conversation rose in the lab. Arthur caught snatches of relief, confusion, and, surprisingly, admiration for the tiny creatures that had caused such a stir. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves," Hargrove grumbled, but even he sounded lighter. The tension in his voice softened. Arthur found himself studying the vial, the silvery, darting fish inside. He marveled at the way something so small could ripple out and change the lives of everyone he knew. Dr. Vance, always the scientist, outlined her next steps. More sampling, outreach to wildlife authorities, and a community meeting at the Green Man pub that evening. She handed out copies of her initial findings and asked everyone to keep a close eye on their horses and their ponds. "Thank you, Doctor," Arthur said, shaking her hand. "You've done more for this valley than you know." Dr. Vance offered a tired but genuine smile. "It's not over yet, but we're on the right track." That evening, the Green Man buzzed with energy. The news had spread quickly, and every table was filled with locals, farmers, their families, even a few curious townsfolk who had only heard rumors. Arthur sat at the center, feeling a bit out of place as the unofficial spokesperson for the horses and their mysterious new friends. Dr. Vance stood up, clearing her throat. "I know this has been a strange and stressful week," she said, "but I want to emphasize something. This discovery is not just a problem, it's an opportunity. We've learned something new about our land, our water, and our animals. We've also seen what can happen when we work together. She spoke about the Garra Rufa, about the importance of monitoring their spread, and about the need for vigilance. But she also talked about curiosity, resilience, and the way communities can rally in the face of uncertainty. We need to respect nature's surprises, she finished, and be ready to adapt, together. The room erupted in applause, some polite, some genuine. Arthur caught Dr. Vance's eye and nodded in gratitude. As the meeting wound down, small groups formed at the bar, old rivalries forgotten, replaced by laughter and speculation about what other mysteries might be lurking out there. Someone even joked about opening the first horse spa in the Cotswolds, and for a moment, everyone's worries faded into a shared sense of wonder. Arthur walked home beneath a blanket of stars, the air fresh and cool. Willow was waiting for him by the fence, head low and gentle. He stroked her mane, whispering, "You started all this, you know." For the first time in days, he felt a lightness in his heart. The mystery wasn't gone, not entirely, but it had been transformed, made manageable by the power of science, community, and a willingness to listen to the land. He looked back at his farmhouse, warm lights glowing in the window, and felt a quiet pride. They had found an answer. But more than that, they had rediscovered the best parts of themselves: curiosity, courage, and the unbreakable bonds of neighbor to neighbor. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, Arthur allowed himself to rest, content in the knowledge that for now, the valley was safe, and the world, as always, was full of wonder. After the breakthrough at the Green Man, something shifted in the valley. Where there had been worry and suspicion, now a sense of possibility hung in the air. The sun seemed to shine just a bit warmer on Broadmeadow Farm the next morning as Arthur walked the fields, breathing in the scent of wet grass and watching Willow nuzzle at the pond's edge. The horses moved with a new ease, their anxieties soothed, and Arthur felt the heavy cloud that had settled over the community beginning to lift. Word spread quickly. By midday, a steady trickle of neighbors arrived at Arthur's farm, not with questions and rumors, but with curiosity and hope. They wanted to see the pond for themselves, to watch the horses wade in and stand quietly as the tiny Garra Rufa went about their work. It wasn't long before someone joked about opening a horse spa, and the laughter that followed was genuine, rolling out across the fields and echoing through the valley. Arthur didn't mind the company. In fact, he welcomed it. For the first time in years, his land felt like the beating heart of something bigger. He poured coffee, handed out mugs, and listened as farmers shared their own stories. Aches that never quite healed, horses that had grown old beside them, fears that the world was changing faster than they could keep up. Now, in the face of this odd, unexpected visitor from far-off lands, they found themselves looking at their home with new eyes. By late afternoon, Dr. Vance returned to Broadmeadow. She'd spent the day coordinating with wildlife experts and local officials, working to ensure the Garra Rufa didn't overrun the ponds or crowd out native species. When she arrived, the small crowd parted for her as if she were a celebrity or a hero. She smiled, exhaustion on her face but energy in her step. Arthur greeted her at the gate. "You're just in time for the grand opening of Willow's spa," he said, only half joking. Dr. Vance laughed. "I hear you've started a trend. I saw 3 cars parked by the Cotton's Brook on my way in. Looked like they were taking photos of the horses." Arthur grinned, more relaxed than he'd been in weeks. You might have solved the mystery, but you started a whole new craze. Dr. Vance knelt by the water, scooping up a handful and letting it run through her fingers. The horses watched her, then returned to their lazy grazing. She looked up at Arthur, her expression turning thoughtful. "It's a beautiful thing, what's happening here," she said, "but it's also delicate. The Garra Rufa don't belong, and we don't know what long-term effects they'll have. We need to balance curiosity with caution." Arthur nodded. "The farmers are ready to help. After last night, everyone feels like they're part of something. What do you need from us?" Dr. Vance outlined a plan: regular water testing, coordinated observation of the horses, and a rotating group to monitor the ponds and creeks. She wanted to document every interaction, every change, building a record that could be shared with both scientists and local officials. More importantly, she urged everyone to see themselves as stewards, not just of their land, but of this new, uncertain chapter in the valley's history. That evening, the farmers gathered again in Arthur's kitchen, cups of strong tea in hand, as Dr. Vance laid out maps and notebooks. She asked for volunteers, and every hand went up. Even Hargrove, the most skeptical among them, agreed to help track the spread of the Garra Rufa, grumbling about damn paperwork, but secretly pleased to be included. They talked late into the night, sharing ideas and stories. Mrs. Barnett, inspired by the odd sense of unity, suggested bringing in an environmental specialist from the university to help advise them. The Cottons, always thinking of the next harvest, wondered if there might be lessons here for their own ponds and crops. And Arthur, sitting quietly at the head of the table, felt the weight of the valley's history settle onto his shoulders, not as a burden, but as a responsibility. For the first time, he saw a future where the community could learn from this, where old ways and new ideas could meet, not in conflict, but in cooperation. The days that followed were filled with a flurry of activity. Farmers dropped by to compare notes, and children, home from school, peered curiously into the ponds, watching the little fish dart between their parents' boots. Even the local newspaper sent a reporter to interview Arthur and Dr. Vance, snapping photos of Willow as she stood, regal and content, in the shimmering water. As word spread beyond the valley, strangers began to visit. Travelers from neighboring counties, hikers passing through, even a retired vet from London who'd heard the story and wanted to see it for herself. Some brought gifts: fresh bread, jam, even a bottle of homemade cider, while others simply came to marvel and listen. Each visitor added a new story, a new perspective, and Arthur's farm felt more alive than ever before. Of course, not everyone was pleased. There were murmurs of concern about outsiders, about change, about what might happen if things got out of hand. One evening, a heated debate broke out at the Green Man, with some arguing for the immediate removal of the Garra Rufa, fearing they'd wreak havoc on the local ecosystem. Dr. Vance stood up, calm but firm. "I understand the fear," she said, voice carrying through the room. "But what we're doing here is unique. We have a chance to manage this responsibly, to learn from it. We can be cautious without being afraid. Let's show the rest of the country what a community can do when it works together." Arthur watched as the argument faded, replaced by quiet conversation and, eventually, agreement. They would monitor the situation, sharing data with the authorities, prepared to act if things changed. As spring deepened, Arthur's farm became a hub for innovation. He set up a small chalkboard by the barn where people could write observations, leave notes for Dr. Vance, or simply scribble encouragement for the farmers and their horses. The Willow's spa sign, painted by one of the local children, drew smiles from visitors and regulars alike. The horses, too, seemed to sense the new mood. They grazed in peace, returning to the water when they wished, no longer restless or anxious. Willow, once again the heart of the herd, moved with a serenity that Arthur found contagious. Sometimes he sat by the pond, boots in the cool mud, and watched her for hours, marveling at the strange twists of fate that had brought them all here. Dr. Vance visited often, sometimes alone, sometimes with researchers or officials in tow. She always made time to talk to Arthur, to listen to the concerns of the farmers, and to remind everyone of the balance they were striving to achieve. One evening, as the sun set over the valley, Arthur stood with her by the water's edge, their reflections rippling alongside the horses. "I've seen a lot in my years," Arthur said quietly, "but I've never seen the valley come together like this. Not for a harvest, not for a storm, never for something so small." Dr. Vance smiled, her face softening. "It's not the size of the challenge that matters. It's how you answer it." They watched as Willow stepped into the water, her hooves stirring tiny fish, the surface shimmering gold and rose in the fading light. In that moment, Arthur understood. The true gift wasn't the answer to the mystery, or even the relief that followed. It was the lesson in change, in curiosity, in community. It was the knowledge that together they could meet whatever the future held, not just with caution, but with hope. As darkness settled over Broad Meadow, Arthur walked home beneath a sky blazing with stars. The land was quiet, the horses safe, and the valley, for now, at peace. But in every heart, a new story was growing, as alive and unexpected as the Garra Rufa in the ponds. A story of resilience, of wonder, and of the power of people working side by side. Spring turned to early summer, and Broadmeadow Farm glowed with new life. The mystery of the Garra Rufa had shifted from a problem to a point of pride for the valley. Each day, Arthur woke to the sound of hoofbeats and laughter, of visitors making their way down the lane to Willow's spa and stables, a hand-painted sign hanging from the gate, its bold blue letters gleaming in the sun. It started with the neighbors and friends. Then, word spread online. A video of Willow wading through the pond, a flock of tiny fish swirling at her ankles, went viral. The phone rang every day. People came for the story, but stayed for the peace. The rolling green hills, the scent of wildflowers, the sight of horses, relaxed and shimmering in the clear water. Arthur was surprised by how naturally the farm adapted. He wasn't a businessman, never had been. But the idea of offering wellness sessions for horses, and on weekends for the occasional curious dog or goat, felt less like a business and more like sharing a secret. The valley's other farmers followed suit, opening their own small spa ponds, welcoming guests from the city and the coast. On any given morning, the yard was full of life. Children giggling as they sketched Willow and her friends, amateur photographers kneeling in the grass for the perfect shot, local teens running tours, explaining how the Garra Rufa had helped unite the valley. An old stone table in the shade became an impromptu information center, with flyers on horse wellness, conservation, and the delicate balance that made the ponds so special. Arthur sometimes sat quietly by the fence, letting the activity swirl around him. He was proud, but cautious. He knew how easily good things could tip out of balance. One bright Saturday, Arthur watched as a bus pulled up at the end of the lane, doors hissing open. A group of visitors, some from London, others from as far as Germany and the Netherlands, stepped out, all chattering excitedly. They snapped photos of the rolling hills and the ancient farmhouse, wide-eyed as Dr. Vance greeted them with a quick introduction about the valley's unique equine wellness experiment. Arthur stood by Willow's paddock, answering questions with a smile. She was the first, he'd say, gesturing to the tall, dappled mare. The one who noticed what was waiting in the pond. We just had to learn to pay attention. Some asked about the science. Others wanted to know if the spa treatments really helped the horses. Arthur nodded. See for yourself. The horses choose when to go in. They're not forced. You can watch how they relax, how Willow moves easier, how the old gelding on the next farm barely limps these days. Maybe it's the fish. Maybe it's just the quiet. Maybe it's both. As more visitors arrived, a soft sense of wonder took hold. A little girl tossed a pebble into the water, gasping as the fish darted away and then returned, brushing past Willow's hooves like a living necklace. Someone asked if they could book a stay. Another wanted to know if there'd be souvenirs. Arthur glanced at Dr. Vance, who grinned. Just remember, this is still a farm, she told them, and the horses come first. The days passed in a steady rhythm. Mornings busy with chores and tours, afternoons filled with laughter and the quiet plodding of horses wading into the cool water. Locals set up a small market on weekends, selling honey, bread, and woolen crafts. Evenings were peaceful, with visitors sipping tea on the porch, swapping stories as the sky blushed pink and gold. For Arthur, there were moments when the changes felt overwhelming. The work was harder, the hours longer, and he missed the solitude of mornings spent alone with Willow. But at the same time, he recognized the gift, how the valley had come alive, how the community had found purpose in something so unexpected. He made time every evening to walk down to the pond with Willow. Together, they would watch the fish glimmer beneath the surface, the pond now a symbol of both healing and hope. Willow seemed to understand. She'd nuzzle his shoulder, soft breath warm against his skin, before stepping into the water, letting the Garra Rufa swarm around her legs. With the success came new challenges. One afternoon, as Arthur helped a group of tourists settle in, Dr. Vance arrived with a clipboard and a frown. "We're getting more interest than we ever expected," she said, keeping her voice low. DAFRA's been in touch. The Department for Environment, Food, and Rural Affairs. They want to make sure we're not causing an ecological problem. Arthur nodded. I've been worried about that too. It's more people, more noise. And the fish, they're everywhere now. Dr. Vance sat beside him on the porch, glancing out over the bustling yard. I've asked the community to help keep the ponds clean, to record every observation. We're sharing data with the university. But if we're not careful, this could all get shut down. Arthur felt the weight settle again, old fears rising. We can't stop progress, but we can't lose what makes this place special either. She smiled, squeezing his shoulder. That's why I need your help. People listen to you, Arthur. You're the heart of this. Together, they set new rules. Visitor numbers were capped. Guided tours became the norm, and every guest had to attend a short talk on conservation before stepping foot near the water. Farmers rotated hosting duties and watched the ponds, making sure the Garra Rufa weren't disturbed or harvested. Every child who visited left with a new respect for the delicate web of life in the valley, and the community continued to adapt. Hargrove, who once grumbled about city folk, became an unofficial tour guide, spinning tall tales for visitors and gently reminding them not to throw bread in the water. Mrs. Barnett started a class on local wildflowers. The Cottons set up a small blind for birdwatchers. Everyone found a way to contribute. The valley grew famous, but it also grew wise. On a cool evening in late June, Arthur stood at the pond's edge as the last tourists departed, the air thick with the scent of grass and honeysuckle. Willow grazed nearby, her flanks shimmering in the sunset. Dr. Vance joined him, her notebook full, her eyes bright. "I think we've found something special," she said softly. "Not just for the horses, for all of us." Arthur nodded, feeling both pride and humility. "It's not what I expected, but it's what we needed." They watched as Willow stepped into the pond, surrounded by a ripple of fish, the scene reflected in the still water, a moment of perfect peace, hard-won and deeply cherished. "I hope we can keep it safe," Arthur murmured. Dr. Vance nodded, her voice gentle. "We will, as long as we remember to listen to the land, the animals, and each other." Arthur stood quietly, breathing in the calm, the promise, and the unknown. The world had come to Broadmeadow for answers, but perhaps the real lesson was this. Sometimes, the greatest gift is learning to live with the questions. And as dusk fell, the farm glowed with quiet purpose, a place where curiosity, kindness, and nature's own small miracles could thrive together. By midsummer, the spa ponds of the Cotswolds had become a phenomenon far beyond anything Arthur, Dr. Vance, or the farmers could have imagined. Local news gave way to national headlines. Bloggers posted dreamy videos of horses lounging among Garra Rufa fish. There was even talk of a segment on BBC's Country File. The valley, once sleepy and mostly overlooked, was now on every tourist's must-see list. But with recognition came pressure and scrutiny. As Arthur walked his fields one bright morning, a convoy of government vehicles pulled up along the lane. The words DEFRA and Wildlife Protection Authority were stenciled on the doors. Out stepped officials in smart green jackets, followed by a few suited figures from the local council. Behind them, reporters snapped photos and asked rapid-fire questions, eager for a quote. Arthur braced himself as Dr. Vance arrived, papers in hand and jaw set with determination. The community had known this was coming. Success, after all, could not last unexamined. The crowd gathered quickly. Farmers, market sellers, even a few worried children. Everyone sensed that the day's meeting in the village hall would decide more than just the future of Willow's spa. Inside, the hall buzzed with tension. Arthur took a seat beside Dr. Vance near the front, his hands rough and steady. The DEFRA representative, a sharp-eyed woman named Ms. Ellery, stepped to the podium and opened her folder. "We're grateful for your cooperation," she began, her voice clear and firm. "The Garra Rufa phenomenon is unique in Britain. However, their introduction is a serious ecological event. Our role is to protect native species and preserve environmental balance." She paused, eyes sweeping the room. "The truth is, we're concerned. Garra Rufa are not native. Invasive species, even seemingly harmless ones, can devastate ecosystems. We must consider containment or removal, or else restrict all access." A murmur ran through the room. Hargrove stood abruptly, voice quavering. "We've been careful. We monitor the ponds, we clean up, we keep records. Nobody's done more than us." Ms. Ellery raised a placating hand. "I appreciate your efforts, but we need a formal management plan and government oversight." Dr. Vance spoke next, standing tall and calm. "We understand your concerns. Our community has responded better than anyone could have hoped, sharing data, restricting access, inviting environmental scientists. We know this is a delicate balance. We're asking for a chance to manage it ourselves, with your support and guidance, not with blanket bans." Another council member stood up, his tone wary. "Tourism is bringing income, jobs, new visitors. But if the fish spread, if our rivers are harmed, we all lose. Arthur watched the debate flare. Farmers pleading for patience, officials listing risks, conservationists warning of disaster. For the first time, the community's new unity felt fragile, stretched thin by outside pressure and internal doubt. As tempers rose, Dr. Vance stepped forward, voice steady but urgent. We're not asking for a free pass. We're asking for partnership. Let us prove that local stewardship can work. Give us a pilot program, limited, monitored, science-led. If we fail, we'll support whatever action you deem necessary. But if we succeed, we'll have a model for other communities facing similar challenges. The hall fell silent. All eyes turned to Miss Ellery. She considered, then nodded. We will review your proposal. In the meantime, new guidelines will be in place. Strict limits on visitors. Mandatory records of water quality. No Garra Rufa may be removed, sold, or transferred. Relief and worry mingled in the air. The meeting adjourned, but the tension lingered as farmers gathered in small knots, voices low and anxious. Arthur stepped outside, blinking in the midday sun. Dr. Vance joined him, letting out a long breath. That could have gone worse, she said, a small smile touching her lips. But it could have gone a lot better. Arthur nodded. They're not wrong to worry. I keep thinking about all the times nature surprised us, good and bad. Dr. Vance tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. It's a test, Arthur. Of us. If we want to keep this, we have to work harder than ever. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of change. DEFRA posted signs along every lane and pasture, warning against unauthorized entry or release of non-native species. Local farmers logged every visitor, every hour spent at the ponds. Dr. Vance and a small team collected daily water samples, monitored fish populations, and checked for signs of environmental distress, algae blooms, missing frogs, shifts in the bird life. The valley's rhythm changed. Gone was the easy flow of open gates and neighborly drop-ins. Now guests had to book ahead, attend a briefing, and sign the new community code. Market days shrank. Casual visitors drifted elsewhere. Some in the community, especially the old guard, grumbled about red tape and the loss of spontaneous joy. Arthur felt the strain acutely. His farm, once a hub of laughter and learning, sometimes felt more like a research station. He and Willow spent quieter hours together, walking the field edges, checking fences, watching for subtle changes in the water and the land. Yet, he also saw the seeds of something stronger, new systems, new trust, and a sense that they were pioneers, not victims, of change. At night, farmers met in secret at the Green Man, voices lowered over mugs of ale. Some talked of giving up, selling the horses, draining the ponds, ending the experiment before it was taken from them. Others, like Mrs. Barnett and the Cottons, argued for perseverance. We have a chance to shape what happens, Mrs. Barnett said, her voice sharp. If we walk away now, we lose everything we built. Arthur listened, weighing each word. He knew they stood at a crossroads, between fear and hope, old ways and new responsibilities. In his heart, he believed the valley could adapt. They always had. Then, one rainy afternoon, DEFRA called a second emergency meeting. A group of environmental scientists had detected a worrying trend, a drop in native minnow populations downstream. The room filled with dread as the implications became clear. The Garra Rufa were, inevitably, having an impact. Dr. Vance rose to address the gathering, her face pale but resolved. This is our chance to show what local action can do. We can adapt. Move the Garra Rufa to closed, contained ponds. We can restore the streams, but we have to move now, and we have to do it together. A tense debate followed. Some wanted to remove all the fish at once. Others feared that would destroy everything, the tourism, the community's new identity. In the end, a compromise formed. A scientific, carefully monitored containment program. The main ponds would stay, under strict supervision. The streams and wild waterways would be restored to their original state. Arthur volunteered his farm as a test site. Willow's spa would become the pilot, a place to balance conservation and innovation, a living example of what careful stewardship could achieve. Hargrove grumbled, but agreed to help. Mrs. Barnett signed up to monitor the new native species nursery. Defra accepted the plan, and so did the council, but the warning was clear. If this fails, the Garra Rufa must go, for good. As the room emptied, Arthur stood in the doorway, heart heavy but hopeful. Dr. Vance joined him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "We're not just fighting for fish or horses," she whispered. "We're fighting for the right to choose our own future." Arthur looked out at the fields, at Willow grazing in the gold-tinted dusk. He knew the path ahead would be hard, the stakes higher than ever. But for the first time, he also knew that the valley's fate was in their hands, and that together they could meet whatever challenge came next. As the first stars appeared, Arthur and Dr. Vance walked back to the farm, side by side, ready for the long work of proving that hope, responsibility, and a deep respect for nature could, in the end, coexist. Summer's gold began to fade, and with it, the rush of tourists and the storm of meetings. The valley, at last, exhaled. Fields returned to stillness, broken only by the slow drift of clouds and the quiet song of birds returning to the hedgerows. On Arthur's farm, the spa sign stayed up, but visitor numbers were strictly capped now, and there were days when the only company was the wind, Willow, and the gentle rippling of the pond. For Arthur, the return to peace was welcome, but different from the quiet he'd known before. He walked the fields each morning, boots trailing through dew, feeling the weight of change settling into the landscape and into himself. The old rhythms were there, yes, the soft snort of horses, the rattle of a pail, but underneath, something had shifted. He was no longer just a farmer. The weight of stewardship lingered in his bones. He'd spent months learning, adapting, wrestling with science and regulation, anger and hope. He'd stood before crowds, spoken to strangers, fought for his land in ways he'd never imagined. At times, it left him exhausted. But there was pride, too, and a new sense of belonging to something larger than himself. Arthur had changed, and so had his friendship with Dr. Eleanor Vance. On a quiet afternoon, when the last visitors had departed, Arthur found Dr. Vance by the pond, crouched beside Willow. The mare nuzzled her sleeve while Eleanor gazed into the water, lost in thought. Arthur watched for a moment, not wanting to intrude, then joined her on the grassy bank. For a while they sat in companionable silence. The air was warm, heavy with the scent of wild thyme and sun-warmed mud. Arthur broke the quiet first. "Do you ever wish it had all stayed simple?" he asked, his voice rough with memory. Dr. Vance smiled, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Some days, I think about that first visit, the fog on the fields, just you and Willow and a mystery to solve. It seemed small, almost easy. But if it had stayed that way, I never would have known this place. Or you." Arthur felt his face grow hot, and he chuckled softly, looking down at his boots. "I was scared, you know. When the Garra Rufa first appeared, when Defra came, when the whole valley was watching. I never thought I'd be the one to stand up at those meetings or talk to a reporter. But you made it seem possible." Dr. Vance looked at him, her eyes gentle. "You did it, Arthur. I just asked questions and listened." They both smiled, sharing the rare, quiet comfort of two people who had faced something extraordinary together and come through changed. As dusk fell, Arthur invited Dr. Vance into the farmhouse. They sat at his old kitchen table, oak worn smooth by decades of use, and shared a pot of tea. The ticking of the clock, the slow creak of the wind in the rafters, the soft thud of Willow's hooves in the paddock outside, it all felt richer now, layered with memory. They talked about the future, about the next phase of the containment plan, the need to train a new group of volunteers, the question of what might come next. But they also talked about themselves in ways neither had before. Arthur spoke of his father and the hard winters spent nursing horses through sickness. He spoke of loss, of the weight of tradition, and how it sometimes felt like he was carrying not just a farm, but a century of hopes and failures. He confessed the loneliness that sometimes crept in during long nights, and how, until recently, he thought that was just the price of loving the land. Dr. Vance listened, her hands curled around her mug, her gaze steady. She spoke of her childhood in the city, of her hunger for open space, of the science that was both a calling and a burden. She told Arthur about the disappointments, experiments that failed, mentors who doubted her, the moments when she'd nearly given up and gone back to a safer life. She spoke of how she had always found herself on the outside, and how, here in this valley, she had finally found a place to belong. It was a conversation without pretense, stripped of roles and titles. In the glow of the oil lamp, Arthur realized he was not just grateful for Dr. Vance's expertise. He was grateful for her company, her challenge, her unwavering belief that the world could be made better through curiosity and care. Days blurred together, each a little softer than the last. The containment efforts settled into routine. Daily checks, careful logs, new plantings along the restored stream beds. Arthur worked side by side with neighbors, sometimes with Dr. Vance, sometimes alone. The valley's wounds, both ecological and personal, began to heal. But the change ran deeper than fences and management plans. Arthur found himself looking at his land with new eyes. He noticed details he'd once overlooked: the slow regrowth of native reeds, the flash of a kingfisher by the brook, the delicate track of a deer at dawn. He took joy in teaching what he'd learned to children who visited the spa, to city families eager for a taste of the countryside, to anyone willing to listen. Dr. Vance, too, grew more rooted in the community. She spent less time in the clinic and more in the field, often walking the boundary lines with Arthur. They debated, sometimes fiercely, but always with respect. They laughed more, too, sharing inside jokes that grew from months of shared struggle. One evening, as they sat beneath the old willow tree, Arthur asked, "If you could do it over, would you change anything?" Dr. Vance thought for a long time before answering. "I might have worried less, trusted more. I wish I'd believed from the start that people want to do the right thing. I wish I'd realized how much difference a few determined souls can make." Arthur nodded, understanding. "It's not just about horses and fish, is it?" She shook her head. "It's about connection. To land, to each other. To the questions we're still trying to answer." A cool breeze stirred the pond, setting the water shimmering in the moonlight. Willow, old and wise, grazed quietly nearby. Arthur closed his eyes, letting the moment sink in. He thought of all they had overcome, the fear, the anger, the uncertainty. He thought of the valley's new future, uncertain but shared. And he thought of Dr. Vance, her presence beside him like a promise. In the hush before sleep, Arthur realized that this was what he had been searching for all along. Not just peace, but meaning. Not just answers, but company on the road to find them. The world was still uncertain, still full of challenges. But in the heart of the valley, among friends, under the watchful gaze of stars, Arthur felt ready, at last, for whatever tomorrow might bring. The calendar slipped quietly into autumn, and with it came a new tradition for Broadmeadow and the Cotswolds. As September's light grew golden, the community planned a gathering, something between a festival and a commemoration, marking 1 year since Willow first stepped into the fog-draped pond and changed everything. The idea had started as a whisper, just a thought passed around at the Green Man. But it caught fire. Now the whole valley was preparing. Families hanging bunting along hedges, children painting banners, bakers perfecting cakes shaped like fish and horseshoes. There would be music, speeches, and for the first time, neighbors from every corner of the Cotswolds coming together not in fear, but in celebration. Arthur watched the preparations with a kind of awe. He remembered that first morning, the confusion, the cold knot of worry in his chest, the way Willow had looked back at him, as if inviting him into a secret world. It felt at once close and impossibly distant, the memory softened by all that had come after. On the eve of the event, Arthur found himself restless, unable to sleep. He stepped outside into the cool night, the fields washed in silver under a rising moon. Willow stood near the pond, ears pricked, as if she too sensed something was about to change. Arthur ran a hand down her neck, letting the memories roll over him. He remembered the gathering at the pond, neighbors anxious. Dr. Vance's keen eyes as she searched for answers, the first discovery of the Garra Rufa. He remembered the tension of meetings, the shock of Defra's arrival, the pain of seeing his quiet life unravel in front of news cameras and government officials. And he remembered the slow, steady healing, the laughter of children, the pride of seeing the community stand together, the comfort of Dr. Vance's presence, especially in moments of doubt. That night, Arthur barely slept. He replayed each moment, the fear, the failure, the triumph. By dawn, he was ready. It was time to celebrate not just a solution, but a journey, a year of change, resilience, and learning. The celebration unfolded under a sky as bright and clear as memory itself. At the center of Broadmeadow, tents and tables sprawled across the grass. Neighbors carried casseroles and baskets of apples, each contribution a reminder of how far they'd come. Dr. Vance arrived early, setting up a display on local ecology and the Garra Rufa containment project, her laugh carrying on the wind as she answered eager questions. As the sun climbed, old rivalries faded into laughter, and even Hargrove was seen handing out cups of cider, boasting of the famous spa horses, as if they were kin. Mrs. Barnett led a procession of schoolchildren on a nature walk, pointing out new plantings and birds that had returned to the valley. The Cottons hosted games near the pond, children's shouts ringing like music. But the heart of the celebration was the ceremony planned at sunset, a gathering by the water, where the whole community would honor the legacy of the past year and look to the future. Arthur was nervous. He'd been asked to speak, as had Dr. Vance. He spent the afternoon pacing the field, rehearsing in his mind. Finally, as the sky blushed gold and pink, everyone gathered near the pond. Willow, dignified and calm, grazed by the water's edge. A hush fell as Arthur stepped up to the small wooden podium. the faces of friends and strangers reflecting hope, curiosity, and quiet pride. He cleared his throat, looking out at the crowd, then let his gaze rest on Willow. "It started with a mystery," Arthur began, his voice steady. "A foggy morning, a horse who broke her routine, and a question I couldn't answer. At first I thought it was just my problem, a farmer's worry, but it turned out to be something bigger, something that belonged to all of us." He paused, remembering the confusion, the fear that change always brought. "We faced a lot," he continued, "not just the unknown in our ponds, but the unknown in ourselves. We had to learn to trust, not only the experts and the officials, but each other. We had to believe that together we could find a way forward, even when it wasn't clear what that way would look like." Arthur's voice caught for a moment. He saw in the crowd the faces of those who had doubted, those who had persevered, those who had become friends in the fire of uncertainty. "I learned something this year," he said softly, "that sometimes the answers we're looking for come from the people standing beside us. That change can bring fear, but it also brings hope. And that when we listen to the land, to our animals, and to each other, we can find solutions we never dreamed possible." He smiled, looking at Willow, who lifted her head as if in recognition. "We're not done," he finished. "There's still work to do. But today, let's celebrate how far we've come, and remember that this place and these people are worth every moment of struggle." A ripple of applause rose, gentle and true. Arthur stepped back, heart thumping, as Dr. Vance took his place. She spoke not as a scientist, but as a neighbor. She spoke of the journey, of the lessons learned from horses and fish, from rivers and reeds, from late-night meetings and early morning walks. She spoke of her gratitude to the valley, for welcoming her, for challenging her, for teaching her that community is not just geography, but shared effort and trust. She ended with a challenge. "Let's keep asking questions," she said, her voice strong. "Let's keep protecting what makes this valley special. And let's never forget that sometimes the smallest things, a fish, a hoof print, a gentle word, can make the biggest difference." As the sun slipped below the hills, the crowd joined hands in a wide, uneven circle around the pond. Someone sang an old folk tune, voices joining in soft harmony. Willow waded into the water, the Garra Rufa swirling around her legs, a living symbol of resilience, curiosity, and healing. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Arthur looked around at the faces glowing in the golden dusk. He saw children who would grow up with this story, elders whose faith had been tested and renewed, neighbors forever changed by the year's strange gift. He thought of his father, of old lessons and new beginnings. He thought of Dr. Vance, standing beside him, no longer just an expert from out of town, but a friend, a partner, someone whose journey was now entwined with his own. That night, as the last lanterns flickered out and the field emptied, Arthur stayed behind with Dr. Vance. They sat on the bank, legs dangling in the cool grass, the pond quiet and bright beneath the stars. "I almost can't believe it," Arthur said softly. "How far we've come." Dr. Vance smiled, bumping her shoulder gently against his. "It's just the beginning." They sat in silence, content, the weight of the past year easing into hope. The air was filled with promise, with gratitude, with a sense of legacy that would echo long after the last visitor left and the Garra Rufa disappeared from the headlines. Willow nickered softly, grazing in the darkness. Arthur closed his eyes, breathing in the scent of water and grass, and let himself believe that the journey, however uncertain, was worth every step. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, but tonight, in the heart of the valley, Arthur felt peace. The story was not over, but its meaning had become clear. The greatest legacies are not built alone, but hand in hand, pond by pond, through courage, humility, and the patient work of caring for the world and each other. The autumn air in the Cotswolds was crisp and clear, with sunlight tumbling across the fields and glinting on the surface of the ponds. Each day, Arthur felt the subtle shift of the season, golden leaves fluttering down, the cool edge in the morning wind, the horses' coats growing thicker in preparation for winter. Life had found its new rhythm, peaceful and steady, yet always colored by the journey the community had taken together. It had been a year of questions, challenges, and unexpected wonders, and now, with the celebration behind them and the future stretching out ahead, Arthur and Dr. Vance found themselves standing by the pond one final time, ready to say goodbye to a chapter and look ahead to what might come next. They stood together as dusk settled over Broad Meadow, watching the last rays of sun paint the water in shades of orange and pink. Willow waded in the shallows, her reflection mirrored alongside the silver flicker of the Garra Rufa. The fields beyond seemed to hum with life, a quiet, steady promise that things would continue, that the story was not ending but evolving. Arthur broke the silence, his voice warm and steady. "I never thought something like this would happen here," he said. "You spend your whole life thinking you know a place. Then one morning it changes, and you have to learn it all over again." Dr. Vance smiled, her gaze soft. "Change is a good teacher. I think this valley was always ready, even if we weren't." They sat on the grass, their boots in the soft mud, and let the quiet enfold them. For a moment, there were no words, just the hush of dusk, the low murmur of horses and the gentle ripple of the pond. Then Dr. Vance spoke, her voice thoughtful. "Do you ever wonder how many mysteries we walk past each day?" she asked. "How many small things are waiting for us to notice? I used to think all the big discoveries would be found in labs or cities or out in the wild places. But maybe the greatest discoveries are right under our noses, if we're willing to look closely and listen." Arthur considered that, thinking of his father's stories of old legends and superstitions. He realized that all along, the real magic of the valley wasn't in the fish or the spa or the headlines. It was in the way people came together, set aside differences, and trusted each other enough to try. He looked at Dr. Vance, seeing not just a scientist, but a friend, a neighbor, someone who had helped him and the whole valley grow into something new. "You changed us, you know," he said quietly. "Not just with answers, but with questions. You reminded us to pay attention, to care, to not give up, even when it's easier to be afraid." She shook her head gently. "You changed yourselves. I just happened to arrive when you needed to remember what community means." As darkness fell, Arthur and Dr. Vance walked up the gentle slope toward the farmhouse. The lights in the windows glowed, promising warmth and rest. At the door, Arthur paused and turned to face her, knowing there were things still left unsaid. "I think people need stories like this," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Not because everything turns out perfect, but because it shows what's possible when we don't walk away from the hard work, when we stay curious, when we help each other, when we face what we don't understand together." Dr. Vance nodded, her eyes shining. "We all need to remember that the unknown isn't something to fear. It's something to meet, to ask about, to share. Every valley, every family, every person faces mysteries. Some are small, some shake us to the core. But if we stay open and honest and kind, there's nothing we can't handle. They stepped inside, the warmth of the farmhouse wrapping around them like a blanket. The kitchen table was already set for a simple meal. Bread, cheese, apples from the orchard, tea in old chipped cups. Willow stood outside the window, her silhouette peaceful under the rising moon. Before eating, Arthur took a moment to write a letter, his own way of marking the end of the year. He wrote not just for himself or Dr. Vance, but for everyone who had been part of the journey, near or far. When he finished, he left it on the table, knowing it would find its way into the hands of friends, neighbors, and maybe even strangers searching for hope. The letter read, "To whoever finds this, if you're reading, you've lived through questions too. Maybe you're facing one right now. My only advice is this: don't be afraid to ask for help. Don't ignore the small things, the strange things. Sometimes a whole world can turn on a horse stepping into a pond, or a neighbor showing up at your door. Stay curious, stay kind, and never doubt the difference you can make, especially when you make it together. The valley is still learning, and so am I. But after a year of storms and sunlight, of trouble and wonder, I believe this: every answer starts with a question, and every question is a chance to belong to something bigger than yourself. With hope, Arthur Graves, Broadmeadow Farm. As the days grew shorter and the nights longer, the valley settled into winter. The spa sign remained, weathered but proud, a quiet reminder of all that had passed. The Garra Rufa, now carefully managed, continued to swirl in the clear water, a living symbol of balance between tradition and change, solitude and community, caution and curiosity. Arthur and Dr. Vance continued their work, not for headlines or visitors, but for the land, the animals, and the people who called the Cotswolds home. They taught children about stewardship, helped neighbors plant new hedges along the restored streams, and shared stories with anyone who would listen. But the true ending, Arthur realized, was never really an ending. Each day brought new mysteries, new chances to learn and to care. Some days there were worries, a dry spell, a sick foal, a government letter. Some days there was only the quiet joy of watching Willow step into the pond, the circle of life continuing beneath the surface. The valley was not perfect, but it was whole. As spring returned and wildflowers pushed up through the earth, Arthur and Dr. Vance stood once more by the pond, looking out across fields brushed with green. "What do you think comes next?" Arthur asked. Dr. Vance smiled, her eyes bright with possibility. "More questions," she said, "and more answers. Maybe not the ones we expect, but the ones we need." Arthur laughed, feeling lighter than he had in years. "Then let's keep looking," he said. They stood in silence, the world wide open before them. To everyone who hears this story, whether you are near or far, in city or country, young or old, Arthur and Dr. Vance offer this. What mystery will you discover if you just pause and pay attention? Who might you help if you reach out a hand? How might your world change if you meet the unknown with wonder instead of fear? Share your story, stay curious, help each other, and if you ever find yourself in the Cotswolds, stop by Broadmeadow Farm. You might find more than you came for: a gentle horse, a quiet pond, a new friend, or even an answer you didn't know you were looking for. So the story ends and begins again. Each day, each season, each heart open to what's next. Thank you for listening. If this story touched you, share it, Leave a comment, let us know your own mystery, and follow along for more journeys of hope, change, and the extraordinary hidden in everyday life.